On February 5th, 2026, at the stroke of midnight, a document expired. No ceremony, no announcement, no emergency session at the United Nations. Just a clock running out on a piece of paper that had been quietly preventing the end of civilization for 15 years. The document was called New START. And when it expired, the last legally binding agreement limiting the number of positioned strategic systems between the United States and Russia ceased to exist. For the first time since 1972, for the first time in over 50 years, the two countries that together hold roughly 87% of every system on the planet are operating without a single binding constraint on how many they can put in the field. No caps, no inspections, no data exchanges, no verification, no guardrails, and almost nobody noticed. The global risk indicator, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, was moved to 89 seconds to midnight at the start of 2026, the closest it has ever been, and that was before the treaty expired. Let me explain what was lost. Because this is not a story about a piece of paper. This is a story about what happens when the world's most dangerous relationship loses its last safety mechanism and a third player enters the arena. New START was signed in 2010 by President Barack Obama and Russian President Dmitry Medvedev in Prague. It entered into force in February 2011. It was designed to do something very specific. Limit the number of positioned strategic systems, the ones loaded onto long-range delivery platforms, vessels and long-range aircraft, to 1,550 on each side. It also capped position delivery systems at 700 per country. And critically, it required something that no handshake agreement can replace: on-site inspections, up to 18 per year. American inspectors walking into Russian facilities. Russian inspectors walking into American facilities, counting systems, verifying platforms, confirming that neither side was lying. This was not symbolic. This was the mechanism that prevented worst-case planning from spiraling into worst-case reality. Because without inspections, both sides must assume the other is doing more than it claims. And when both sides assume the worst, both sides build more. That is the definition of a strategic competition. And that is precisely what is now possible. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to 2023. In February of that year, in the aftermath of the full-scale events in Ukraine, Russia announced it was suspending its participation in New START. Not withdrawing, suspending. The distinction mattered legally. Russia said it would continue to respect the system limits, but it would no longer allow inspections. It would no longer exchange data. It would no longer participate in the bilateral consultative commission that managed the treaty. In response, the United States revoked the visas of Russian inspectors and stopped sharing certain technical information. From that point forward, the treaty existed on paper, but the mechanisms that made it work, the trust infrastructure, were gone. By 2025, the treaty was an empty framework walking toward its expiration date. Under its terms, it could only be extended once for 5 years. That extension was used in 2021 by President Biden and President Putin. There was no legal mechanism for a second extension. The only option was a new agreement. No new agreement was negotiated. In September 2025, Putin made what appeared to be a pragmatic offer. He proposed that both sides continue observing the treaty's limits for 1 year after expiration. No new treaty, no formal extension, just a mutual commitment to keep respecting the numbers. When asked about it, the President of the United States said it sounded like a good idea. That was the last meaningful public statement on the subject. No formal response was ever issued. No commitment was made. And on February 5th at midnight, the treaty expired. The next morning, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement saying it considered itself no longer bound by the treaty's obligations. It said it would act with restraint, but warned it was prepared to take decisive measures if its security was challenged. The American response was notable for what it did not contain. No urgency, no emergency diplomatic effort, no announcement of a replacement framework. The president posted online that it was a badly negotiated deal and that experts should work on a new and improved treaty that could last long into the future. And then the news cycle moved on. But the consequences did not. Here is what most people do not understand about New START. The system limits, 1,550 on each side, were not the most important part of the treaty. The inspections were. Verification is the foundation of strategic agreements. It is what allows two countries that fundamentally distrust each other to make binding commitments about their most consequential capabilities. Without it, you're not doing strategic agreements. You're doing hope. And hope is not a strategy when 12,000 systems are involved. The United States currently possesses approximately 5,177 total systems. Russia possesses approximately 5,459. Under New START, each side was limited to positioning 1,550. The rest sat in storage, maintained, modernized, but not mounted on delivery systems. Now, legally, there's nothing preventing either side from pulling those systems out of storage, loading them onto delivery systems, and increasing the number of positioned systems. The United States has already begun discussing this. The president's proposed budget includes $62 million to reopen previously closed operational tubes on existing vessels. That is not theoretical. That is an active appropriations request. By some estimates, the United States could position an additional 1,900 systems within a decade by pulling capabilities out of reserve and uploading them onto existing platforms. Russia can do the same. It has hundreds of reserve systems and active production lines. Its modernization program has been running at full capacity for years, and it has been developing systems specifically designed to evade any future limits. Advanced maneuvering vehicles, underwater autonomous delivery systems, and long-range delivery platforms that exist in no treaty framework. But this is where the story takes a turn that most analysts have been warning about for years, because this is no longer a two-player game. China has entered the field. In 2020, China was estimated to have approximately 350 systems. By 2026, that number has grown to an estimated 600 to 700. That is roughly 100 new systems per year, 2 per week. No other country on Earth is expanding its reserve at this pace. The Pentagon's most recent report projects China will reach over 1,000 systems by 2030, and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimates China could hold 1,500 by 2035, matching the level that was once the legal ceiling for the United States and Russia. China officially maintains what it calls a no first use doctrine. It says it will not use its capabilities unless it is struck first. But doctrines are policy statements. They can be changed with a single speech, and the expansion itself sends a different message. When you go from 350 to over 1,000 in less than a decade, you are not maintaining a minimum deterrent. You are building towards strategic parity, and that changes the math for everyone. The United States now faces what no American administration has ever had to manage, a simultaneous strategic challenge from two major powers at once. This is not the bilateral cold-era competition that strategic agreements was designed for. This is a three-way dynamic where each side's decisions affect the calculations of the other two. If the United States builds up to counter China, Russia sees a direct challenge and responds. If Russia expands, the United States feels pressure to match, which alarms China further. If China accelerates, both the United States and Russia react. It is a feedback loop with no natural stopping point, and no treaty to serve as a circuit breaker. This is the world we entered on February 5th. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated that any future agreement must include China. That is a reasonable strategic position, but China has flatly refused. Beijing says it is neither fair nor reasonable to ask a country with 600 systems to negotiate alongside countries with over 5,000 each. Its position is simple. Reduce your numbers first, then we will talk. Russia has added its own complication. Moscow says that if China is brought in, then so must the United Kingdom and France, which hold approximately 290 and 225 systems respectively. So the negotiating framework has expanded from 2 parties to potentially 5, and none of them are at the table. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking on something else, the global non-proliferation architecture. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, is the cornerstone of the international system that prevents the spread of these capabilities to additional countries. Its review conference is scheduled for this spring in New York. And every non-possessing state that signed that treaty did so on a promise. The promise was that the countries that already possessed these capabilities would work in good faith toward reducing them. That was the deal. You do not build them, we reduce ours. For 50 years, that bargain held. Strategic agreements treaties between Washington and Moscow, from SALT to START to New START, were the visible evidence that the promise was being kept. Now the last of those treaties is gone. No replacement is being negotiated, and all 3 major powers are expanding. Every country at the NPT review conference this spring will be asking the same question. If the countries that made the promise are no longer keeping it, why should we? The cost of this moment is not measured in systems alone. It is measured in trust. The entire global system for preventing spread depends on the credibility of the countries at the top, and that credibility just expired alongside the treaty. Now let me take you back in time. Because to understand what was lost, you have to understand what was built, and how close the world came to losing everything before the first treaty was ever signed. In October 1962, an American reconnaissance aircraft flying over Cuba photographed Soviet medium-range strategic installations being assembled on the island, 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world stood at the edge. President Kennedy imposed a maritime perimeter. Soviet ships carrying additional components steamed toward the Caribbean. American forces went to the highest readiness level ever reached short of active engagement. A Soviet vessel commander, cut off from communication with Moscow, came within 1 vote of authorizing the use of a special device against the American maritime perimeter. 1 officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to give his consent. One person, one vote. That is how close it came. And it was that crisis, that single week in October, that convinced both Washington and Moscow that mutual destruction without communication was not a strategy. It was a countdown. Within a decade, the first agreements were signed: the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, the SALT Agreements in the 1970s. Then came the INF Treaty in 1987, eliminating an entire class of intermediate range systems from Europe. Then START 1 in 1991, which cut positioned strategic systems by roughly 80% from their Cold Era peaks. Then the Moscow Treaty in 2002, then New START in 2010. Each one built on the last. Each one added inspections, verification, data exchange, and mutual accountability. Each one said the same thing. We do not trust each other, but we agree that this competition, left unchecked, ends in crisis. That architecture took 53 years to build, treaty by treaty, inspection by inspection, compromise by compromise. And on February 5th, 2026, the last piece of it expired. There is nothing underneath. No treaty is being negotiated, no framework is being discussed, and no summit is being planned. The Pope called on both sides to do everything possible to prevent a new competition. The UN Secretary General urged an immediate new agreement. Both statements were noted by the press. Neither changed anything. Now let me bring this to something people can feel. Because the numbers are abstract. 5,000 systems, 1,550 limits, 87% of global inventory. An abstraction is the enemy of urgency. So here is what it means in human terms. A single modern strategic system, the kind covered by New START, has a yield of roughly 300 to 400 kilotons. A major city in 1945 was 15 kilotons. One of these systems carries roughly 25 times the force used on a single city in 1945. One vessel carries approximately 90 systems. One vessel can reshape a continent. The United States operates 14 of these vessels. Russia operates 11. And neither side is now legally required to tell the other how many systems are loaded, where the vessels are positioned, or what targeting posture they have adopted. Every assumption each side makes about the other is now based on estimation, satellite imagery, and inference. Not data, not inspection, not verification, estimation. And when estimation is wrong, when one side believes the other has positioned more than it actually has, the rational response is to position more yourself, just in case. That is the logic of a strategic competition, not malice, not aggression, uncertainty. And uncertainty is now the only currency in circulation. Rose Gottemoeller, who led the American negotiating team that created New START, described the situation with precision. She said the treaty brought both sides down to 1,550 positioned systems from far higher levels. And she warned that without it, worst-case planning becomes the default mode for both governments. Mike Albertson, who was involved in negotiating, ratifying, and implementing the treaty, pointed to the Cold Era as a cautionary tale. He said that era is full of examples, where each side had assumptions about what the other was doing, some of which were faulty, and which led to expensive competitions based on who was seen to be ahead or behind. That competition consumed $5.5 trillion in American spending alone. Adjusted for today's economy, that is over $10 trillion. The Soviet Union, unable to sustain the burden, eventually dissolved, not solely because of the strategic competition, but the economic weight of perpetual strategic competition was a decisive factor. And this time, the competition is not bilateral, it is trilateral. The United States, Russia, and China. 3 economies, 3 strategic doctrines, 3 sets of interests, operating without a single binding constraint among them. Christine Wormuth, who served as Secretary of the Army, described her primary concern. She said we could end up engaging in an unconstrained competition with both Russia and China at the same time. She said building up would be very, very expensive at a time when the national debt is already tremendous, conventional forces need investment, and domestic priorities are being deferred. The current modernization program alone, replacing existing systems, not expanding, is projected to cost $1.7 trillion over the next decade. If expansion is added on top of modernization, those numbers climb significantly, and the money must come from somewhere. Let me bring this to where it affects you directly. The United States is currently in the middle of a $1.7 trillion modernization of its entire strategic capability. New intercontinental systems, new vessel platforms, new long-range delivery aircraft, new command and control infrastructure. That figure was calculated when the cap was 1,550. If the decision is made to expand beyond those limits, the costs will rise significantly. And those costs come out of the same federal budget that funds everything else. Every dollar spent on additional strategic capacity is a dollar not spent on infrastructure, healthcare, education, or reducing the national debt. The federal debt of the United States already exceeds $36 trillion. Interest payments on that debt are now the single largest line item in the federal budget, larger than the entire allocation for national security. Adding an unconstrained strategic expansion on top of a $1.7 trillion modernization program would require either massive new borrowing, significant cuts to other programs, or both. And this is not an abstract budget debate. It is a choice between building systems designed to never be used and investing in systems that people use every day. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, broadband. Every system that gets pulled from storage and loaded onto a delivery platform has a cost, not just in dollars, but in opportunity. And the same is true for Russia. Moscow is already spending an extraordinary percentage of its GDP on its current operations and modernization. Adding a new expansion on top of that would strain an economy that is already under significant pressure from economic restrictions, demographic decline, and the ongoing cost of its operations in Ukraine. Russia's economy is roughly 1/10 the size of America's. It cannot sustain a long-term spending competition at the strategic level and maintain its conventional capabilities at the same time. But history shows that governments under pressure often choose strategic expansion precisely because it is cheaper than maintaining large conventional forces. You do not need a million-person standing force if you have enough systems. That logic drove Soviet investment for decades, and it may drive Russian investment again. And for China, every new system it builds requires not just the system itself, but the support infrastructure, command networks, early warning systems, secure communications, hardened storage facilities. That makes the capability credible. This is not cheap for anyone. And history shows that unconstrained competition makes everyone poorer without making anyone safer. The United States spent over $5.5 trillion during the original Cold Era competition. Adjusted for inflation, that is over $10 trillion in today's dollars. The Soviet Union spent itself into economic collapse, partly because it could not sustain the economic burden of matching American capability across every domain. An unconstrained three-way competition could dwarf those figures. And it would happen in a world where the economic margin for error is much smaller than it was in 1985. Now here is what you should watch. And I want to be specific because the stakes here are too high for vague conclusions. First, whether the United States and Russia reach even an informal agreement to continue observing the old limits. As of today, Russia's foreign minister has said Moscow will show restraint if Washington does the same. But without inspections, neither side can verify the other's claims. Words without verification are just words. And the initial Russian statement, issued the morning after expiration, said the opposite. It said Russia considered itself no longer bound. It was only a week later, after Foreign Minister Lavrov addressed Parliament, that the tone shifted. That inconsistency tells you everything about the fragility of the current arrangement. Second, watch the NPT review conference this spring. More than 190 nations signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Most of them gave up the option to develop these capabilities in exchange for a promise from the 5 recognized possessors, the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France, that they would work toward reducing their own. If those nations begin signaling that the bargain is broken, and some already are, the ripple effects could take years to unfold, but they will be irreversible. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Brazil all have the technical capacity to develop these programs. They chose not to. That choice was based on a system. The system is now weaker than at any point since it was created. Third, watch the Pentagon budget. The $62 million to reopen vessel operational tubes is a small number, but it is a signal. If that line item grows, if upload programs are funded, if new production facilities are authorized, if the industrial base receives expansion orders, the competition has begun. And once it begins, momentum takes over. Fourth, watch China. The pace of expansion has been roughly 100 per year. If that accelerates, if new facilities come online, if testing allegations prove credible, the three-way dynamic enters a phase that no existing diplomatic framework is equipped to manage. Just hours after New START expired, a senior American official publicly accused China of conducting secret capability tests. China denied the allegation. No public evidence has been presented. But the accusation itself, made at that precise moment, tells you where Washington's attention is focused and where the next confrontation may unfold. Fifth, watch the global risk indicator. It moved to 89 seconds before the treaty expired. The scientists who maintain it will update it later this year. And they will be doing so in a world with no limits, no inspections, and no negotiations underway. For 53 years, from 1972 to 2026, there was always a piece of paper, always a framework, always a mechanism, however imperfect, that said to the two most capable powers on Earth, this far and no further. That mechanism is gone, and the third power is rising, and the clock is still ticking. If you want to understand the forces shaping the world's most consequential decisions, make sure you are following this channel. Because this story has no ending yet, Only a countdown.